Alright guys, welcome back to episode 8 of the Carmaker REVIVE Drift Kart series. Today we're going to be going through the remainder of the dash wiring and fitting it back into our ProKart. This is the last of the Drift Kart series, so enjoy, because next up we're going to film a question and answer video. So remember to leave all of your questions into the comments below or send us a message and we're going to answer them in our next video.
In one of the next videos, probably the next video. Getting the wiring done, get it finished, get it in the cart, and let's make this happen.
Flame transition.
Oh man, I love the flame transitions. Flame!
恐怖は敵であり、味方でもある。
Welcome back guys to this, which will probably be the last installment of our Revive Drift Kart series, where we finish off the dash wiring that we started in the last episode. So we have assembled all the bits and pieces. They're all glued in if we spin it around. We use the polyurethane adhesive, glued them all in place so that when we continue with the wiring, none of the components are now going to move. One of the first things that we want to have a look at with our wiring even before we begin is where the wiring is going to actually run behind our aluminium dash panel. So the vast majority of the wiring needs to come up off the switches and the key barrel and the start button, run underneath this bracket, behind the gauge and out this side. That is going to have it if you're sitting on the cart with all the wiring coming down the left-hand side of the frame, running to where the rest of the wiring is underneath the floor. If I grab one dash panel that we've started wiring for a customer's cart and I hold it up, I can give you an idea of how that wiring is going to look. So we still have to terminate the rest of these wires, but all the wiring is going to run from the switches, the start button, the ignition barrel, underneath this flange, behind the gauge, out this side and down the side of the frame. Okay, let's jump over to our dash that we're currently working on and we'll have a look at what we need to do first. The first thing that we want to prepare is the back of our ignition barrel. Previously we cut the wires off. There's still a little bit of sheathing covering the wires and sometimes a metal bracket that basically just stops these wires from moving around too much. The problem with this is going to be it won't allow our wires to kind of tuck over where we need them to sit. So if it has a little metal bracket on it, I'm going to bend that now out of the way and cut it off. This one has that bracket. So I'm just going to open up the little clip, bend the bracket out of the way. It has a small little rivet sometimes holding the bracket to the back of the barrel. Try and resist grabbing it and trying to yank it off. You'll often just tear the ignition barrel apart. So I'm going to cut off that metal bracket as close to the barrel as I can get it, and that'll be fine. I've cut off the metal bracket from the back of the ignition barrel. The sheathing and the plastic cover, I'm now going to discard that as well. What you'll find now is all of this wiring is able to tuck over nice and neatly and be able to easily run along the back of our dash panel. We do need to be careful while handling this wiring. If you tend to bend this wiring backwards and forwards too much, you risk breaking all the wires or a couple of the wires here at the barrel. So just take care.
All right, just off camera, we've had a closer look at these connections and we're not too happy with them. So we're going to actually run new wires. If you guys have a look at it and you are happy with it, you can connect to these existing wires.
So if we take a little bit of a closer look at where the wires are soldered to the back of the ignition barrel, if I just give them a little bit of a move around, I can see that most of the strands in each wire where it's actually soldered and connected have already broken, and we haven't actually done anything to this yet. So if this connection was great, awesome, we could just solder to the end of these wires. But because these connections are already, the wires have already started breaking, we just made this decision that we should probably solder straight from the individual soldered connections, and we'll just run new wiring from there. Rather than trying to desolder all of these and then solder on new wires, one at a time, we're going to cut the wire off and solder a new wire on. So let's get to that now. We've got our dash panel sitting on the bench, and I've grabbed some good quality automotive wire. Now, in regards to doing the wiring for the car, we're going to try and stick with the same color wire that is used throughout the kart. So coming from the back of our ignition barrel, we have a white with a black trace, a green, a black, and a red. So I have what ends up being a black with a white trace, a green, a red, and a black. In order to start this, from the back of the ignition barrel, you're going to need those 4 lengths, and you're going to need just short of 1 meter or around 3 feet of each. So we've got the wire here. I now need to remove one at a time the wire from the back of the ignition barrel and solder on my new wire. It's worth pointing out, when you go to remove these wires, don't try and heat it up and desolder it. Obviously, these are soldered into a plastic ignition barrel. If you go placing too much heat into the back of the barrel, it's just going to melt and fall apart. So this black with a white trace or white with a black trace, I'm going to clip it off as close to the terminal as I can get it. Then I'm going to tin my wire and solder that on. So let's get it happening. My white wire with a black trace, I've got my side cutters. I've cut it off as close as possible, discard the wire. Get my new wire. I want to strip off about probably 5-6 millimeters or around just under 1/4 inch. Then what I generally like to do is give the wire a bit of a twist, fold it back on itself, so that when I go to solder it, it allows me to get a bit more solder onto the end of that wire. Now, if you haven't done much soldering before, don't be too turned off. Take your time, try not to put too much heat into the back of the barrel, and you should pretty much be fine. I've got my wire, I've bared the end, folded it back on itself. It helps if you've got some way of holding this so that you can hold the solder in one hand and the soldering iron in the other hand, and obviously not have the wire just sitting on the bench. So a simple way to do this is open up your side cutters, sit them on the bench like such, in the jaws of the side cutters. My wire is now going to sit there ready to go. I can grab my soldering iron that's heated up, and I have my roll of solder. So open up my solder, come over with my soldering iron, making sure that it's hot and ready to go, which it is. And I want to what I've tried to do is obviously tin my wire, and then I've put an extra large blob of solder on the end of the cable, so that when I go to fit this to the back of the barrel, I've got plenty of solder to melt from my wire down onto the back of my barrel. I'm probably going to add just a tiny bit more solder to the back of the barrel as well. Now, when I do this, I don't want to stick my soldering iron on the back of the barrel. I'm going to hold it slightly above, melt some solder off onto my soldering iron, and then kind of drop it onto the back of the barrel. So I've tinned the end of my wire. I've added a little bit of extra solder to the back of the barrel where this wire needs to go. I'm now going to get down there and solder the two together, making sure that I don't put too much heat into the back of the ignition barrel. Mainly, I'm just going to heat up this side and then melt it into the piece that I've already got there. So let's get this done. I've got the two joined together. I'm going to give it a little bit of a tug. I've got a good connection. There's no need at this point to add any more heat to that one terminal. Once we finish the rest of these, we're going to cover that in some polyurethane adhesive just so they can't move or be damaged. So we're going to fast forward a little bit and I'm going to get these other three wires done. Being sure that one at a time, I'm going to remove them, add the wire, and then get on to the next one. Let's do this. We just soldered those 4 wires to the back of the ignition barrel and we now have them running off to this side. The next thing that we want to work on is the 2 switches. We need to pay particular attention to the way that these switches were glued in. We should have probably spoken about this in the last episode. And that is with a silver terminal at the top, a silver terminal in the middle, with the gold terminal at the bottom. Let's grab some wire and we will start soldering or terminating wires to these 2 switches. We're going to add a wire to the very first terminal, one closest to me or at the top. This terminal will be the terminal going from the switch to whatever it is that we're trying to give power to. So the one closest to me that I'm pointing to now, I'm going to make the brake light switch to turn the brake lights on and off. And I'm going to add a blue wire with a white trace to this terminal. So I'm going to bare the wire and get it soldered on. So with these terminals on the back of the switches, there's a little hole in the back of the terminal. What I like to generally do is bare about a centimeter, 10 millimeters, or just under ½ an inch. I'm going to twist the wire, poke it through the back of the terminal on the switch, twist it around and twist it back onto itself. Then when I go to solder it, I don't have to worry about the wire moving on the back of the switch. So I'm going to get to it. So again, about 10 millimeters or just under ½ an inch. I'm going to twist that wire. This is going to be a little bit fiddly to get into, so bear with me. Straight through, up. So I've got the wire sitting in place. I'm now going to solder it on. So much like we did before, I want to try not to put too much heat into the terminal, just enough to get the solder to flow and cover the wire. I've added the blue with the white trace to the back of this switch. To the switch next to it now on that rear terminal, the one closest to me, I'm now going to add a white wire. That's going to run off and power our underglow when we put LEDs in later on. So I'm going to get a white wire attached to this. I'm also going to jump ahead because there's a fair bit of wiring here to do. The back of the horn here closest to me, I'm going to add a black wire with a red trace and get that run off as well. So I'm going to get to it. Is run a short red power wire about yay long off of this switch, and the back of the horn. I'm going to get those cut and soldered on right now. So I've just soldered on a red wire to the middle of the switch, the middle of the next switch, and to the other terminal on the horn button. The next thing I need to do is solder on about the same length of green wire to the gold terminal on the bottom of each switch. This is going to end up being an earth so that when the switch is turned on, the switch will light up. So I'm going to cut those green wires and get them soldered on. We've now wired the ignition barrel, the brake light switch, the underglow switch, the horn button. The next thing we need to wire up is this start push button. If we look closely around these three terminals, it'll have a number on each of the terminals. So we have a 1, 2, and a 3 if I look closely. Number 1 is going to be power in. Number 2 is going to be power out. And number 3 is going to be an earth so that the start button lights up. So what I need to do first is I'm going to run a green wire off number 3 out with the other green wires. I'm then going to jump ahead and keep going. The next one I'm going to wire up is a yellow wire off of number 2. I'm going to get that done. The next thing we need to do is attach the yellow wire and the green wire to the back of the start button. In order to do this, I need to somehow attach the wire to the Phillips head screw. Rather than crimping a ring terminal onto the wire, I'm going to actually make a loop in the wire, solder it, and then I'm going to screw that underneath the terminal. And I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So I'm going to pull the screw out and have a look. Get an idea of how big it is. I'm going to strip back about 3/4 of an inch, or about 19 millimeters of wire. Give that a twist. Now you could take something like the screwdriver here, wrap the wire around that just to get a bit of a loop, pull it out, hold it, give it a little bit of a twist. I can now solder this loop and then I can screw the loop in place. So I've just made a nice little soldered loop on the end of my wire. I'm now going to screw that underneath the Phillips head screw. Again, this green is going to be the earth. I know green doesn't typically mean earth, but throughout the drift kart wiring or the pit bike wiring, green is going to be earth. And this green is going to go to number 3. I'm now going to repeat exactly the same thing with the yellow wire, bearing that end, making a loop, soldering it, and I'm going to attach this under number 2. It's worth noting at this point as well that the yellow wire is going to go all the way down to the start solenoid wiring, so I've made it rather long. I can trim it to length later on. The last thing I need to do is I'm going to cut another red wire about the same length as that yellow wire, and that's going to attach to the number 1, and that's going to be the power into the start button. I'm going to cut that wire, make a loop, solder it, and get it attached right now. I'm just going to remove the screw from the number 1 terminal. I'm just going to add some solder to the end of that wire where I made the loop. I'm now going to screw that ring terminal that I've made down again to that number 1 terminal. We've finished wiring the ignition barrel, our brake switch, underglow switch, horn, start button. We want to come over now to our shift indicator. We have a bunch of sheathing on the end of the cable that we need to remove, and I'm going to chop off all the terminals that were on it. So let's get to prepping this. The first thing I want to do is cut off all the ends. Also, on a lot of the shift indicators that we will supply, there is a black small ring end. This isn't actually an earth. This is the main power feed in order to turn on the switch indicator. The rest of these wires end up just being individual earths that will turn on the different numbers on the shift indicator. So the black terminal here, I'm going to cut the ring terminal off. We've stripped all the sheathing off the outside of our shift indicator. I've also bared the ends of the wires there and on the end of the small black wire. I'm going to get Matthew in to give me a hand to hold this. We're going to run a quick test on this with a small battery just to make sure that we are using the right wires. So black is going to be power. Each of these is going to be an earth, only we have 6 wires here and we're only going to need 5 of those. So we're going to need neutral, first, second, third, fourth. One of these will be unnecessary and I'm 99% sure it's going to be the yellow one, but we're just going to double check that. So I'm going to hold the black short lead on a positive terminal of my battery. I'm going to try going through the different colors and we're going to see which one lights up. Really, I just want to find which one's 5th gear because we're not going to need 5th gear because we don't have a 5-speed gearbox. So you guys can tell me what number lights up?
1.
So it's 1.
2. 3. 4. Neutral.
Yep. So that leaves us with the yellow wire. So again, the yellow wire is not going to be needed. I'm going to cut out this wire and we can get on with wiring up that shift indicator. Let's get to it. There's that yellow wire that we don't want. I'm going to cut that back as far as I can get it. And that yellow wire won't be needed. I'm going to strip back the small black wire and I'm going to solder on a red wire to this because this is going to be the power into the shift indicator. So strip back this black wire. So extended my wire. I'm going to add a little bit of solder to this and then I'm going to heat shrink it just to protect it. The next thing we want to do is each of the wires here, these are all going to be obviously earth. I want to strip back about 3/4 of an inch or about 19 millimeters of each of these wires. I'm then going to twist on a length of black wire to each of these. So each one will have a length of black wire and I want each of those lengths to be about 3 feet long or just under a meter. One little trick that I want to show you guys is I have my 5 black earth electrical cables there that I need to solder on to my 5 colored wires here. If I was to join all of them in one place, I'm going to end up with a big bunch of joins. So what I tend to do is cut each of these wires a little bit shorter than the one that I cut before it. So if I cut them all back a bit and then cut the others back further than that, and then cut the others back a little bit further again. What will actually happen when I solder or join on all of my black wiring and run it rearward is that none of the joins will line up with the join next to it and it will keep the wiring nice and simple and tight. I won't have a big bulge where all of the solder joins are. So I've got one more there I need to shorten back. That will do it. Okay, I'm going to get to stripping each of these wires and join it to a black wire, twist it, solder it, and heat shrink it. So we've just soldered on 5 black wires to each of the colored wires out of our shift indicator. What I'm going to do now is cut some heat shrink, and I'm going to heat shrink from the back of the shift indicator just out about, let's say about 6 inches. And that's going to run around the back of the gauge. So I'm going to cut the heat shrink, get it fitted, then we'll move on to wiring up our gauge. So we've just finished the wiring for our shift indicator. We have all our earths run and we have our main power feed for that shift indicator that we're going to terminate in a minute. The next thing that we need to get onto is the wiring for our gauge. Now we chose an RPM gauge. If we have a look at the wiring that came with our gauge, we've got our main power harness here. Now this is going to differ for most gauges, but in the case of this one, it has 4 wires. So we've got a black, which is going to be an earth, a yellow, and yellow is going to be ignition power, white's going to be illumination, and we're going to twist both of those together so they both power at the same time, and we have a red that is constant power. So that's what my loom looks like. I'm going to strip the sheathing on this loom back to about here, and then we'll have a look at how we're going to terminate these wires. Okay, so I've bared the wires or the sheathing back on my main power loom for my gauge. I'm going to plug this in, and then we can have a look at how the wiring is going to run. So this one is going to plug in on this gauge on one side. I'm going to run it around the back of the gauge and off the way that our wiring is going. The next thing I want to do is, this one being an RPM gauge is going to need only one input, and that is going to come from this power wire. This is going to end up going down to our coil, which is going to give the pulse for our RPM. So I'm going to plug this one in at the same time. It's worth noting, if we look at the back of the dash panel, some people who have done quite an amount of wiring before would probably think to themselves, why haven't I jumped, say, the green earth from one to another to another to another? Just for the simplicity to show you guys at home, we're going to run all of these off to the side, and we're going to join all of the wires that need to be joined together over here. This can be then hidden inside the loom. So if you're not really good at getting in here and doing the soldering and all the fiddly kind of work, it's way easier to join them out here than it is to do small little loop wires on the back of the switches. So we've got our gauge plugged in. I've got all my wiring here. I'm going to take a minute to have a bit of a think about it, and then we're going to start connecting all of the different wires over this side. Also, because we're now ready to connect or terminate all the wiring over here that's going to be inside the loom, I'm pretty happy with how all the wire sits. We're going to run urethane, or the adhesive, over the top of all of these wires so they can't move later on. But I'm just going to take a zip tie. I'm just going to pull the wires back there, because my steering column obviously goes through this hole. And so these don't move while I'm working or later on when I urethane them, I'm just going to place a zip tie down through and around this spot, just so the wires are held nice and tight so they can't move. Now later on, when the dash is installed and all the urethane that we're going to apply to the back of the switches later on has dried, we can cut off that zip tie and everything will be held nice and firm. So we're going to have a look at the wiring over here. In order to simplify some of the wiring or make it a little bit neater and easier to follow, I've taken all of the earths that are coming from the shift indicator. I've placed a couple of zip ties on them, and I've got them running off to the side. I now have all my main wiring loom running off over here. The first thing we want to look at terminating is all of the earths. So we have a main green wire that's running the length of our loom that we can find over here, that's coming from the ignition barrel. This is our main earth. So I also have a green that's coming off the back of this switch, and off the back of the start button. All of those are these small greens just here. What I'm going to start by doing is trimming all of these greens to the same length. I'm then going to bare back about 1.5 inches of each of those, and I'm going to twist them all together to join all of those earths. Now that I've twisted the earths together from each of my switches, I also need to think of what other things I need to earth. Now, coming from the gauge, if I look at the 4 wires coming from the gauge, the black on this is also an earth. So I'm going to measure that out to be the same length, trim that wire back and twist it in with these greens, which are the earth for our main wiring harness. I now have each of the components earthed. I'm going to find the green power cable running through the harness, which is just here. What I want to actually do is bare some of the sheathing off of this cable, and all of the rest of these earths can be joined into that main green. So I'm going to take my scalpel, put a nick, could probably use my strippers. There and there. So my main earth cable from my dash down to my cart now has a bare section. I've got all of the rest of my earths, and I now want to twist them around this cable. So what I've basically done is taken each component, run an earth, joined all the earths together, and we only really need one cable. I'm going to actually add at this point one more earth that's going to come off here and out. This is going to be the earth halfway down the front of the cart is the horn, and I'm going to need an earth for the horn. I'm just going to place a little bit of solder on that joint. I don't want to cover the whole thing. A little bit of solder on that joint, and then I'm going to put a little bit of heat shrink over the top of it. Now that we've connected all of our earths together, we're going to connect all the power for our different bits and pieces. So we have a power coming from the ignition barrel, a power going from the start button, from each of the switches, and power from the horn. So each of those power electrical wires we've made red. I'm going to find all of those wires, we're going to bare them, twist them together. In the case of this gauge, we also had the yellow and white, the yellow being switched power and the white being illumination. We're going to twist those together as well. So all of the reds, the yellow, the white, twist them together, and let's get to it and have a look how it's going to go. Okay, so I've grabbed all my red wires, I've figured out which ones I need to join. I'm going to cut these all back now so they're at the same length. And we'll strip those wires and get them twisted together. More reds. Now that I've twisted all of my red power wires together, the switched power to our gauge and the illumination from our gauge, I've also included the power wire from the shift indicator. Each of these need to be twisted in or attached to the black wire that's heading from the back of our ignition barrel back to our kart. This is actually the switched power, so this will only get power once the switch is turned on or once the key is turned on. So I'm going to have a look at where I need to add it, which is about here. I'm going to strip a section out of the sheathing on that black wire, and I'll twist in those red wires, solder it, and then put some heat shrink over it. If we look at our harness now, all our earths are joined together, all our power wires from after the key to power up each of our components are joined together. There's one more power wire that we need to connect for this particular dash. Because our gauge has an electric peak recall function, it has a memory. So we have one red wire just here that needs to have constant power. That is, it's always going to get a power feed from the battery in order for the gauge to keep its memory. So our red wire that's coming from the engine all the way up to our ignition barrel, this is our constant power. This is always going to be live. So this red wire is going to be twisted into this red wire coming from the kart up to the barrel. So I'm going to measure out roughly where it's going to sit, about there. I'm going to strip some sheathing off the two red wires, and we'll twist them together and heat shrink them. That's all our dash panel wiring complete. At a later point, we're going to cover each of the components in the polyurethane adhesive just to stop these from being able to either arc out or to be bumped and broken. Before we move any further, at this point, it's a good idea to go through and test each of the switches and the components. Now, if you know how to use a multimeter, you can set it to continuity and you can go through and check, have I got a connection from the end of my earth to every point that I have an earth on each of my components, and then also making sure that there's no continuity to any other place. Now, if you're pretty sure or you rate yourself that you've got this spot on, what we can actually do is set up a little bit of a test rig. So I've got a 12-volt battery with a positive and negative lead to some small alligator clips. I've got my negative lead from my dash panel here. I'm going to attach the negative lead from my battery to this. I've also made my positive lead slightly longer so it can't accidentally touch my negative. Now, the red wire running all the way up to the dash panel is going to be our main power feed. So I'm going to grab that red wire, bare a little bit off the end, and I can attach my positive lead from my battery to this, and then I can see if my dash is actually going to work. Now, when I take my positive lead from my battery and I get close, just give it a little brush. If for some reason it sparks across, there's a chance that there's something wired incorrectly that is drawing power straight away. Nothing on here should be drawing power, so if I go to put this close, it shouldn't spark. And there's no spark. So at this point, I've probably wired everything correctly. I'm going to attach my positive lead to my main power lead to my dash. I'm going to sit that down here. If I then pick up my dash panel, nothing's happening. If I take my key and place it in the barrel, once I turn the key on, I should have my start button light up, and this gauge should actually sweep through its range of motion. So I know that once I've turned the key on, I've got power to my start button, I've got power to my gauge. My shift indicator isn't going to light up because none of the negatives that are running towards the cart have been plugged in or connected. Each of my switches that could run a component, if I switch these on, they should also light up. And we have our horn button here, and obviously because the horn button's not connected to anything, if I press this, nothing's going to happen. Turn my key off. And we're good. It's also worth pointing out at this point that off camera we ran a quick test on the dash panel, and we actually realized from our initial wiring that the power to the two switches, we'd run our red power wire to the middle terminal on our dash, which was this one, and then we ran the power from the switch back to the cart off the top terminal or silver terminal. Now, we actually had these around the wrong way. What that actually did is as soon as you turn the key on, the switch light lit up, and it didn't matter if the switch was on or off. So if you want the switches to always be illuminated, you could leave it exactly as it was, but if you want the switch to illuminate once you turn the switch on, we're going to need each of those red wires to the top of the switch, each of the power wires running back to a component in the middle, and then the earth or the green electrical leads are still going to be attached to the gold terminals on the bottom. Now that we know that all our dash panel wiring is correct, at this point here where we have a kind of log of different wires, I'm going to grab some larger heat shrink. We're going to bunch all our cables together and we're going to cover this section with heat shrink. We're also going to cover each of the components with some polyurethane adhesive just to hold them in place and obviously stop them from being damaged once they're mounted in the cart. I'm going to grab the heat shrink this, we'll cover this in adhesive and then we'll get it mounted into the drift cart. Ta-da! Now goo. Okay, we've heat shrunk around about the first 6 inches or 150 millimeters of the wiring loom. Our gauge is mounted in place, everything's good. We've covered the back of each of our switches and components with some of the polyurethane adhesive. I've also used a little bit extra to glue down some of the wires so they can't vibrate or flap around. We're now going to get the table cleared. We'll get the cart up on the table and we'll put the switch panel into the cart and start running the rest of the wiring. We've got our REVIVE ProKart back up on the bench. We've finished doing our dash panel wiring. It's now time to remove the steering wheel, steering column, and we're also going to undo the 2 M8 nylock nuts that are holding the top bearing in place, ready for us to fit that dash panel. So let's remove the steering wheel and undo that bearing and have a look at how we're going to fit that dash panel. I'm going to grab a 13mm socket and we'll undo the 2 M8 nuts. We've removed the steering wheel, we've undone the top nuts that are holding the bearing on for the top of the steering column. We're now able to grab the dash panel and we're going to fit it over the top of these two bolts and put those nuts back in place to hold the dash panel on. At this point, we would also highly recommend that once you've obviously Sikaflexed or applied the polyurethane adhesive to the back of your gauge or your dash panel, probably sit this aside overnight before you go to fit it, just so that it has a chance to dry. Obviously, we're trying to just finish off this last part of the install. The rest of that polyurethane is still wet, which is making it a little bit fiddly to tighten up everything without it actually getting all over us. So let's persist and get this tightened up. We've fitted our dash panel to our ProKart, refitted the steering column and steering wheel. The next thing we need to do is find our horn wiring that is going to be sitting just here somewhere. So if I hunt through my wiring loom, I had white that was underglow, I had blue white which was the brake, and I had a black red. There's the black red. That black red is going to be the power to the horn. We also had a green when we fitted that extra earth. So one of our green wires, which is right here where it splits. And there we go. So power to the horn, green being earth from the horn. These are going to need to terminate just here. I'm going to cover these with a little bit of heat shrink, cut off the excess. We'll crimp on some female spade terminals. Then we'll come back and look at how we're going to finish off the rest of this loom. Let's get that done. So we've terminated the two wires that are going to go to the horn, placed female sheathed spade terminals on those. We now need to continue adding some more heat shrink over the rest of the loom. So again, I'm going to heat shrink down over that wire and then continue along back to approximately the back of the clutch pedal. So we'll get this heat shrinked and then we'll have a look at how to terminate the rest of the wiring loom. We've run our dash panel wiring down the side of the frame. I've just placed a bit of tape around the dash panel wiring and the frame to hold it nice and securely in place. We've come down, we've terminated and plugged in our horn. I've run down behind the front floor brace, so it's not going to interfere with the floor. We've then run the wiring underneath or along the floor. It's worth pointing out that when I heat shrunk the wiring, I separated it once I came underneath the front of the cart into two separate lots of wiring. So we had one big bunch of black wires that are going to run off to the shift switch. There's a whole group of black. From memory, there's 5 black wires in that group. We've heat shrunk them in their own bunch. We then also have the rest of the wiring that needs to be terminated. So I'm going to lay that out. This is going to be the first thing we're going to work on. You'll also notice near it, we have the wiring coming from the engine harness that we terminated in a previous video. These first 4 wires are the ones that we need to find in the loom and trim and place bullet connectors on right now. So we need to find the green wire in the loom. We have that right here. We also need to find the white, black, the red and the black. So I'm going to find these 4 wires in the wiring that we've just run down from the dash panel. I've got the green, there's the white, black, there's the red and the black. So I'm just going to neaten these up and make sure they're not overlapping any other wires. This red can go underneath there. So there's my 4 wires running from my dash panel. Again, green, black, white, black, and the red. I'm going to trim these one at a time, all to the correct length. I'm going to have a little bit of slack in this, so don't have it nice and tight. About there will be fine. So I'm going to trim all these wires back to just here. Now that we've trimmed all the wires back, I'm going to bare or strip some of the insulation off those wires, approximately a centimetre or just under half an inch, or 10 millimetres. Twist that wire, fold it back, and we'll have a look at terminating these ends. If we have a look at the 4 wires that we've just stripped, I'm going to start with our green being the earth and our green in our loom. So the green that we've previously terminated, we've got a male bullet end on, so we're going to place a female on the dash side. So female bullet end, twist on. Again, this would be a great spot to put a decent 4-pin automotive connector, but at the absolute least, bullet connectors will do the job. If we go to another one, we have a black-white with a female. I've then got my black-white here in the loom from the dash. I'm going to place a male on it. Okay, let's go to our next wire. We've got a black. So we're going to grab the black in our loom that's got a male. So the black coming from our dash is going to have a female. The last one we've got is a red. If we have the look in our loom, we've got a female on our red, so the one coming from the dash, we're going to place a male on. We could easily plug these in at this point. If we plug this in, our dash is going to receive power. We probably don't want that, so let's look at terminating the rest of the wires. So the next one that we're going to do, or the most important one in order to make it run, is we have a yellow cable here. This yellow lead needs to run across the floor, and it's going to plug into the one that we've previously terminated, being the yellow in our loom. So that particular one in our loom, that yellow has a male terminal, so we're going to run this across and put a female on this one. Now this is the power to the start solenoid. This is going to make it crank. It's also worth pointing out that in a past video when we terminated this plug from the start solenoid, the wiring used to come into the plug, and for some reason this particular manufacturer had swapped the colors of the wire. After we terminated this bothered us a fair bit. It was going to be a little bit hard to explain. So off camera, I've unplugged this, depinned it. We got rid of the black wire that's not necessary, and I took the yellow wire that was over here and repinned it in where it's meant to be. So that yellow wire will now come in through this bullet connector, down through the yellow wire, through the plug, and continue into that yellow red wire. Okay, so if we grab that yellow wire and sit it over the top of the floor of our cart, we look at where the yellow wire with the red trace that goes to our start solenoid is going to sit. I can get an idea of how long it needs to be. I'm going to grab that cable there, cut it to length. We've got a male bullet end that we've already placed, so we're going to need a female bullet end on the side coming from our dash loom. Place a bullet connector on that wire, that yellow wire coming from the dash. So we're going to have a yellow to yellow. We've got the rest of these that are going to go into our engine loom. We're then left with a white and a blue. Now, this white we're going to hook up to underglow. We're not going to do that in this series. This white that's running from the switch in the dash that could be underglow could be used to power anything. So at a later date, we may hook this up. What I'm going to actually do is cut this wire back, fold on itself. I'm going to grab some heat shrink, place it over this and shrink it on. That way, if the switch is turned on in the dash, this can't be arced out against anything. So a little bit of heat shrink over it. We also have this blue wire with a white trace. This is going to be for our brake lights. This is going to supply power to the brake light system. So if we have a look at the wiring that we've already done from the tail lights through past the hydraulic handbrake handle, we have our terminal here. Again, it's another male bullet terminal. If I work out roughly how that's going to sit, probably I'm going to tuck it over here and have a look at how long that blue cable is going to need to be. I'm going to cut that to length, strip it, and we'll place a female bullet and connector on this blue wire. Okay, generally speaking, this would be the vast majority of the wiring you would need to do. We also have this long wire that's running down from our gauge. It is a single red wire. This single red wire is going to need to get a signal from the coil. So I'm going to wrap this around. Now is probably a good time. We're going to plug all of those wires in that we've terminated. The last thing I want to plug in is the red and the black that's coming from my engine loom, as one of these will be powered up at the moment because our battery's connected. So if we grab the blue, and we're going to go to the wire that comes from the brake light system. We're also going to go, what are we going to do next? We can do those 4 engine loom wires. So I'm going to start off with the black with the white trace. Then we're going to go to the green, being the earth for the whole system. Then I'm going to go to my black. And lastly, I've got my red. I also have my yellow that's sitting here, which goes to my start solenoid. So I've got the yellow to the start solenoid, plug them together. So if I sit that wiring there, we can neaten that up at a later stage. So I come back around to this side of our cart. All of our engine wiring is done from the dash panel down to the engine. We've connected our RPM gauge as well. If I turn on the key, I should see the start button light up and probably the gauge as well. So let's make sure, let's see if we got it right. Okay, my start button lights up. My gauge is lighting up. Now this first light was going to be the brake switch light. If I turn that light on, the switch lights up. If I then also grab my hydraulic handbrake and have a look, I can see that my brake lights are lighting up. If I press on the foot pedal, I also want to see if the brake lights light up. Awesome, so we've got the brake wiring correct. I can turn that switch off. That second switch that we're going to wire to underglow at a later point, we haven't terminated yet. If I turn the switch on, it lights up, but obviously it's not connected to anything yet. If I also test my horn works. The last thing we need to do to finish this off before we refit the floor is we need to terminate those 5 black wires that are going to run to our shift switch. I'm going to jump around the other side of the cart and we'll get this done. We've got our shift switch wiring coming from the dash. I've found my shift switch wiring coming from the engine. We're not going to need this plug. All of these are earths. I don't have to worry about how I cut them or if they touch anything. So I'm going to cut this plug off. I next want to strip some of the sheathing off so that I can get to each of these electrical wires so I can trim them and place a terminal on them. So I'm going to grab my scalpel and trim this. All I'm going to do next is on each of these wires coming from the shift switch in the engine, I'm going to strip them and I'm going to put a bullet connector on them. It doesn't matter if it's a male or female, as each of these is going to be an earth, it's not going to matter. Okay, so we've terminated all the wiring coming from the dash from the shift switch with a female bullet end. We've terminated all the wiring coming from the shift switch in the engine with male bullet ends. I now want to turn my dash panel on, and it's basically going to be a case of plugging or trying different connections until we find the one that lights up the number that we want. So at the moment we're in neutral. I'm going to place it into first gear. I'll give it a little bit of a rock. So we're now in first gear. I want to grab my cables, and if I plug one in, I've got neutral, so neutral is not what we want. If I go another one, I'm looking for connection 1. So I've got first, so I now know that I'm in first gear, that's the right one. I want to plug it together. I'm now going to go into second gear, and I'm going to try the connections now. Watching that shift switch. Nothing. Neutral there, that's the wrong one. Third, second. So we're in second, I plug that one in, it lights up second, so I want to totally plug it in. Go into third gear, I'll just double check, and we're in second. That's fourth, might as well find fourth while we're here. There we go, straight away that was fourth, plug fourth in, go back to third. I've only got 2 cables left to choose from. Let's try this one. No, that one's neutral. So that one's third, so plug third together. And the last one left, I can obviously just plug back in. So, they're all plugged together. If I go back down through the gears, I can check. So I tend to give the cart a rock backwards and forwards as I'm putting it into gear, just to help it select gears. So second, first, neutral. So when I'm in neutral, it lights up N, first, second, third, and fourth. We're good to go. I'm going to jump off camera. I'm going to spend a little bit of time. I'm going to neaten up some of this wiring and just tuck it out of the way. Then I'm going to refit the floor panel, and I'll come back and we'll have a look at it all back together. Okay, so we've just put our bait.
It's all right, bud. I'm going to take it from here.
Awesome.
Thank you for watching our CarMaker Revive Drift Kart series. This is the last video, so now you can go out, ride, have fun with all your mates, fang around, rip some gears. We want to see some videos of it, so upload, share it around. Remember to tag us. Also, leave a comment down in the little box down there. We're going to do a question and answer video next about all of the karts. So anything you guys would like to know, send it in, we'll answer it.
Until then, like, subscribe, follow along.
Hit that bell thingamajiggy.
Ring my bell.
And we will see you soon.
See you soon. Pew, 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 pew.
Flame transition, bunny, out the door. That was easy. All right.
Hello there. No, what do we normally say?
Well, I'd do it because you're shit at it.
No, we do it so you got something to say because you got nothing to
Yeah,
say otherwise.
We normally say, g'day, welcome back to episode 8 of Car Make Revy. All right, guys, I messed that up. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna run through, connect this, start it up, burn the tires off the bloody thing, rev the engine all the way out the back, get the cops around the corner to arrest probably the guy behind the camera, because it wasn't me, mate. No face, no case.
Oh, that's actually really good.
Okay, let's go with that. All right, G. Flame transition.
Oh man, I love the flame transitions.
Same.
Flames!
Flames.
Flames! Can you even do like the shake? Yeah. It's like flames!
I gotta not look down while I'm talking because your fidgeting makes me look at what you're doing.
I have,
and my brain
man,
goes to mush.
having something in my hands.
Yeah.
Clean up!
Clean up, back up, go and put your hands up. Woo! Whoop, whoop, whoop. Remember to come to my concert. It's live, it's free. Leave me some money at the door. for more wraps.
What are we leaving money for?
My food. My bills. Mate, we don't do this for free.
Okay, that way.
And we're out.
恐怖は敵であり味方でもある